Hi everyone, my name is Janet Twyman and I'm really pleased to be talking with you about behavior analysis in education, a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. But why should behavior analysts care about education? Well, the fact is, as Nelson Mandela said, education is one of the most powerful tools which we can use to change the world. We can make a meaningful difference in all learners' lives. All learners' lives. And in fact, there are over 1.4 billion students on Earth, over 62 million educators. Yet there are still 57 million children without any access to schooling of any kind. No basic schooling, no reading, no writing. In fact, 1 in 5 school children worldwide do not have basic literacy skills. They don't have, many students don't have access to schools, and if all students had basic reading skills, there'd be a 12% reduction in worldwide poverty and impoverishment. We know that education is important. Greater educational levels have been shown to reduce poverty, to increase personal well-being, to increase social stability, to increase personal income across the lifespan, and to garner stronger relationships. So education is important. But how are we doing with education? Well, not all students actually have basic reading or writing or mathematical skills. This 2015 chart from the National Assessment of Educational Progress shows that U.S. proficiency in reading and math in 4th grade and 8th grade. So the left-hand side column are math scores, the right-hand side are reading scores. The bottom sets of scores are for 8th grade students, the top sets of scores are for 4th grade students. So where are most of the scores? What colors are most of the scores in? Well, they're obviously not in dark blue, which represents advanced proficiency or superior performance. They're not even in the regular blue, which is proficient, which just means solid academic performance. Most of the scores are in yellow and orange. Yellow is basic, and that means that there's only partial mastery of prerequisite skills that are foundational for learning at each of those grade levels. And then of course orange is below basic. In every instance, 50% of America's kids, over 50% of America's kids are at basic or below basic. And it's a shame. And we know how to build better schools. Skinner clearly saw the importance of working in schools and working in education, especially after he saw his 4th grade daughter's classroom. He went into the classroom and saw what he considered really horrible inefficiencies, not on the fault of the teacher, but by the fault of the setting and the environment and the contingencies in place. Multiple learners were expected to learn the same thing at the same pace, regardless of what their personal histories were, what their background knowledges were, how well they were equipped to learn. The teacher was presenting the same lesson to multiple students, and every lesson presented resulted in different learning outcomes for the learners. Some students grasped the material, some did not. So Skinner saw a huge opportunity to apply the science of behavior to education and to schooling. And he was not alone. In the early 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, other behavior analysts began to work in education. Not only was there Skinner writing about the technology of teaching, but Keller worked on the personalized system of instruction. Og Lindsley worked with special education teachers and special education settings and looked at professional development. Ivar Lovaas looked at the application of behavior analysis to learners with autism. But Skinner did more than talk about processes and practices. He also thought about how can we build devices that can support education. And so back in the early 1950s, 1960s, Skinner and some of his students worked on what he called the teaching machine, an automatic or self-correcting device that presents a unit of information, presents an opportunity for the learner to respond, contingent feedback to that response, and then a continual shaping process of the subject matter at hand. So why was Skinner interested in education? Why did he think that this was so important? Well, he really thought about behavior analysis as a means of both equalizing and making teaching and learning much more efficient for all learners. He knew the importance of contingencies and the 3-term contingency and feedback. So he focused on immediate individualized feedback for every learner, whether the response was correct or incorrect. He really wanted to focus on the rapid formation of new behaviors, building concepts, building new skills. He wanted learners to be motivated and actively participate and have the opportunity for high rates of meaningful responses. And he wanted to build a science and a technology and a tool that could be used with any learner, any grade, any subject matter. So obviously, one of our fathers in behavior analysis, B.F. Skinner, was very interested in education and what it could offer. And so was one of his closest colleagues and friends, Fred Keller. So this is a picture of Fred Skinner and Fred Keller in the basement of B.F. Skinner's Cambridge home. And they were both interested in behavior analysis and operant psychology, but also in education. One of the things that I want to point out, folks may miss in the bottom of this picture, there's a little box on the table, a teaching machine. So it's really nice. They're probably talking about Skinner's new invention and all the amazing things that they could do. And around that same time, Fred Keller wrote a paper, one of his seminal papers called Goodbye Teacher, that talked about the process of teaching and learning, what it is that the teacher could do, how the contingencies in the classroom could be arranged to promote better teaching and learning. So study after study. So Fred Keller devised with his colleagues at the University of Brasilia in Brazil, devised this system of teaching where learners would go at their own pace and they wouldn't progress until mastery, and they built this PSI course and started to talk to their colleagues about it, and other folks replicated features of PSI, to where so many studies, and even a 1979 meta-analysis of over 75 studies on PSI, showed that it reliably increased student learning, motivation, and better retention after class. And so PSI was an enormous contribution of Fred Keller to behavior analysis in education, focusing on college teaching. Or so we thought. Because also while in Brazil, Fred Keller wrote a lesser well-known paper called Peter Opossum Goes to School. And so basically, it's talking about PSI as applied to K-12 education, or in this case, this cute little cadre of woodland creatures that Fred Keller writes about. And he talks about how these students can go at their own pace, and there are proctors to help them learn the material that they weren't able to grasp, and they didn't progress until mastery. And also in this little booklet, in the little paper that Fred Keller had illustrated, what's in the bottom corner? Yet another teaching machine. So there's a nice theme to how we're talking about using both technology of tools and technology of process to improve education. And this isn't just back then. Even last year, the Chronicle of Higher Education wrote a wonderful article about PSI, about its humble beginnings and the impetus for PSI, the research that has grown in PSI across the decades. And I talked about all the critical features of PSI. The go at your own pace feature, where students take as much time, it's kind of a stretch to fit or squeeze to move forward. They take as much time as they need to be able to learn the material and progress. So basically the pace is commiserate with the student's own ability or their own time demands. This unit perfection, what we call recycle to mastery, it's making sure that kids know, that the learners know what they need to know before moving on to the next step in the material, more complex material, so that things build upon each other or scaffold upon each other. The use of lectures were just for motivation or for explaining key concepts, but basically most of the learning was a student interacting with the material, being able to come in contact with the material again at their own pace, at their own time. And those proctors were there to support students that needed extra time or extra help or wanted additional information to carry their knowledge further, but also to build that social relationship that we all know is an important part of learning. So all of this is about PSI, and this is written about PSI just a year ago. So we're still having that impact in terms of what behavior analysis has to offer higher level college teaching. Again, it's not just higher level college teaching, because we have this whole cadre of research-based practices on which we build behavior analysis in education and how we support teaching and learning. And this is just a sampling, a tip of the iceberg of the programs and models that behavior analysis has influenced over the decades. There is PSI, Personalized System of Instruction, which we just talked about. There's a close kinship with direct instruction that talks about arranging their communication or how information is presented to the learner to make sure that there's a reduced error and that they can build new concepts by scaffolding and building information over time. Precision teaching, which focuses on that rate of response and a critical part of B.F. Skinner's experimental work, so looking at fluency in learning and being able to make decisions on teaching and learning based on a standard way of looking at data so that we can look at all learners and all behaviors. School-wide positive supports, which has its roots in behavior analysis and now has a national center on school-wide positive behavioral support to support proactive, pro-social, pro-academic behaviors in schools all across the nation and around the world. Programmed instruction, which is something that B.F. Skinner and Jim Holland started earlier in their careers in the 1960s. And so talking about, again, that careful arrangement of instructional sequences to promote the learning that we want. And then, of course, that all leads into behavioral instructional design with the work by Susan Meyer-Markle, Phil Tiemann, and others about looking at, again, context and behavior and setting environment and really thinking about how to arrange contingencies to get student learning. So all of these are powerful programs, and again, it's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of things that behavior analysis has influenced or partnered with or directly brought to bear. So there are key aspects of behavior analysis that of course are relevant for education. Those key aspects of behavior analysis where we use the method of science to guide our practice, that's critically important when we're talking about teaching and learning and developing teaching practices. When we're talking about using behavior change procedures systematically and using it technologically in the terms of the rigor of the tools of our science, well, that's extremely important in education when we think about implementation and how to work with learners. We want to use procedures that are conceptually derived from basic principles of behavior because we know that that's what works. Those basic principles, we're standing on the shoulders of giants in our field with regard to everything that they've researched and built into applied procedures that we can use in the classroom. And of course, what is more socially significant than education and classroom behavior and being able to educate all learners so they have those outcomes that we talked about at the very beginning of this talk. And then finally, because behavior analysis is a science and the behavioral application, the application of behavior analysis to education is also a scientific endeavor, we want to make sure that we're always measuring and always knowing that the factors responsible for the change in learner behavior, that we understand those factors, we understand those contingencies, and we can change them to build better classroom environments and better instruction. Because as Bill Heward said, the primary goal of behavior analysts working in education should not be getting teachers, not be getting educators to just use behavior analysis, but we should be using behavior analysis to make education better. And I think that our field is absolutely ripe to do this. We can do this with behavior analysis. And like we said, part of the reason that we can do this is that we're standing on the shoulders of giants, such as Og Lindsley, Fred Keller, Fred Skinner, and many, 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 many more. Ultimately, the goal of behavior analysis in education and the goal of research in behavior analytic education is to improve practice, to have practices that result in improved student learning and improve the lives of our learners. ABA strength, behavioral education strength, is on the focus of improving teaching practices and teaching and learning in ways that are direct, measurable, and replicable. So it's extremely important that we not lose sight of the fact that we're founded on a science and we can use that science in all of our classroom applications. And that science, as I've tried to convey, has a very rich history. So this is just a screenshot of this behavior analysis and education timeline that's, the URL is on screen, but basically it is a work in progress that demonstrates or documents the publications, the models, the programs throughout that rich history of behavior analysis. When was Goodbye Teacher written? When did B.F. Skinner invent or release or disseminate the teaching machine? When did Morningside Academy's School of Generative Instruction start? So there's this wonderful timeline that we can use to enrich ourselves with regard to the history of behavior analysis. And then this timeline allows us to delve deeper so that we can click on and obtain a publication or learn more about a model. And so next, we're going to actually look at a series of publications, kind of sampled by decade. Again, just to focus on that rich history and rich contribution of behavior analysis to education. So most of the publications in behavior analysis in education started in the 1950s and 1960s. Many of them were by B.F. Skinner, talking about education, of course, Fred Keller, but also others like Tom Gilbert and other behavior analysts at the time. And usually in the 1950s, 1960s, a lot of the key takeaways of those publications was that teaching is a science. That teaching is made tangible, can be made tangible with things like the teaching machine or programmed instruction, but still the instructional sequences were based on science. In the 50s and 60s, we learned about good behavioral objectives, and we also learned about the good behavior game, a terrific way of using dependent and independent contingencies to shape good classroom behavior. At this time, Keller also wrote Goodbye Teacher, and in Goodbye Teacher, he wrote, I learned one important thing. The student is always right. He's not asleep, he's not unmotivated, he's not sick, and he can learn a great deal if we provide the right contingencies of reinforcement. So thank you, Fred Keller. In the 1970s, the lens began to widen. How we were looking at education began to broaden to school systems and to education in general, including higher education. Skinner in 1974 encouraged us to broaden our scientific thinking about teaching and learning. And he said, an effective design must be based on understanding of behavioral processes. The basic questions are these. Why should anyone teach? And why should anyone learn? Skinner went on to say that these are questions about human behavior and recent advances in the analysis of behavior. Recent advances in the analysis of behavior are helpful in answering these questions. Why should anyone teach? And why should anyone learn? We know it's a contingency analysis. And so many of these publications began to try to take apart or understand those questions and understand the contingencies around education. So in the 1980s, Skinner continued his work attempting to answer those questions and thinking about teaching and learning. And through his work and the work of others, we dug deeper into programming the subject matter. Lots and lots of work about programmed instruction and arranging instructional contingencies in ways that result in more efficient learning, really looking at, can we do what we do better? Can we reach more learners? Can we enable more teachers to do this? And then also in the 1980s, we began to share that message not with just behavior analysts or other psychologists, but with teachers and the educational community at large. Skinner at that time stated, we could not solve our major problems in education if students learn more. Let me say that again. We could solve our major problems in education if students learn more during each school day. It simply means using time more efficiently. So what Skinner encouraged us to do, or put forth for us to do, is to be clear about what is to be taught, be clear about the subject matter, be clear about the objectives. Teach first things first. Think about your task analysis. Think about your instructional sequence. Think about prerequisite skills, not just in terms of what students need to do beforehand, but what are some of the other contingencies that need to be in place before students might be able to learn or demonstrate a skill. Stop making students advance at essentially the same pace. We are still trying to learn that lesson about having students progress in K-12 schooling, progress, or in college at essentially the same pace. Skinner saw that when he visited his daughter's 4th grade classroom. He saw that as one of the big difficulties or fallacies with regard to effective education. Students can't progress at the same pace. They are unique individuals, and the environment needs to support them as such. And then, of course, he wrote, program the subject matter. And all he meant by that simple statement, is actually do your deconstruction of the instruction, do your task analysis, do your concept analysis, analyze critical and variable attributes about what you're going to teach, and then arrange the contingencies to build that repertoire. And so we can do it for physical behaviors, but also academic behaviors and intellectual and cognitive behaviors. Finally, in the 1990s, we continue to broaden that message. We're getting bigger and bigger about the role that we want to play with regard to behavior analysis and education on the world stage. I would recommend that of course, every article listed in all of these slides be read. But if you had to pick one slide, especially these articles, this selection from the 1990s, and out of that, if you had to choose just one, perhaps it would be Weston Hammerlink's book that begins, Weston Hammerlink's book is Designs and Excellence in Education. And the book starts with a chapter by B.F. Skinner called The Shame of American Education. And it talks about all the missed opportunities in education in terms of how we've structured it physically, how we think about learners, how we prepare our teachers, how we involve families, and how there might be a better way. So it's in some ways his Walden 2 vision of education kind of scripted out in that first chapter. So it's a really wonderful read. A second read, and again, if you're interested in education, it would be great. I mean, all of them are such wonderful gems. But in the final listing, in this book put out by the Ohio State University, it's part of a series on behavior analysis in education. This one is called Behavior Analysis in Education, Focus on Measurably Superior Instruction. In that compilation of several chapters by different folks, Bushell and Bear wrote this chapter that gave us a statement called 3C ROD, close continual contact with the relevant outcome data. That is just such a critical piece, an adage for all of us to think about, not just in behavior analysis and education, but everything that we're doing when we're applying behavior analysis to better human good. We want to have that close, continual contact with the relevant outcome data. And so they say that close, continual contact with the relevant outcome data is a fundamental, distinguishing feature of applied behavior analysis, and it ought to be a fundamental feature of classroom teaching as well. And I think that as behavior analysts, we would all support that. In the 2000s, we had many, many more folks writing about education. We were reminded that ABA, that behavior analysis works for everyone. This includes all learners. So Bill Heward reminded us that ABA is broadly relevant. ABA-based interventions have been successful to students of all ages, students of wholly different ability levels, students from diverse cultural, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds, students from poor, middle income, and wealthy families, and students enrolled in urban, suburban, and rural school districts. That's basically everyone. ABA-based interventions have increased student achievement in basic skills, standard academic content, and in social skills. Again, ABA is broadly relevant. And then finally, if we just look at a few publications from 2010 to the present, these more recent publications still talk about the design in education and talking to a broader audience and the pieces of information, the strategies and tactics that we can apply to schooling. But now there's also an interest in digital technologies and how do we marriage digital technologies into the skill set that we have, the development of software applications, and again, this kind of renewed interest, greater interest in behavioral instructional design. And so this section, I'm actually including a quote, one of my own, from an article on education and technologies. And I said that it is with an emphasis on the practices used in teaching and learning, such as instructional design, the delivery of instruction, and the contingencies that affect both, that behavior analysis could make its greatest mark in education. So I think it's based on these practices that we have and how we can marry those with technology that we're poised to make an even greater continued difference in the future. So without a doubt, the principles and methods of behavior analysis underlie many of the effective procedures used in schools today. It is a fact that these strategies and tactics underlie many of the evidence-based practices that teachers are thinking about and recommend to use today, both in K-12 education and in college teaching. And these practices, we were very lucky to have Embry and Biglin identify as 52 kernels, or 52 evidence-based teaching kernels that come out of behavior analysis, that are robust, that work with students with all abilities, all ages, all context, all different parts of subject matter. And these are kernels because they're discrete, foundational units of behavior change. You can use these kernels in different things, in different procedures, in different practices. And these kernels have been verified by both experimental science and applied replications, applied analysis. And these kernels are useful because they're relatively easy to implement. They're little kernels that teachers can pick up, and they really do produce these desirable, discernible outcomes with learners across socially relevant, valid behaviors. And researchers have told us that educators are more likely to embrace a practice if it's simple to do, if it's easily tested, if it has really readily observable effects. It has to offer an advantage over what they're already doing. It has to address an important skill. And it has to be compatible with what is already going on in the classroom or in the school routine. And if researchers are saying these are the types of practices that teachers are more willing to adopt, we would note that these are the types of practices that behavior analysis has to offer. Excuse me. So, excuse me. Kernels can also be enhanced with digital technologies. We are in exciting times with regard to digital technologies, software, devices, applications. We have the teaching technologies, the processes, but we also have now the ability to enhance our processes with digital tools. So we've gone from the day of Skinner's mechanical teaching machines to computer-derived digital technologies, smartphones, smartwatches, tablets, laptops, and who knows what else the future has to bring to us. All of these can help us do behavior analysis so they can make what we do easier, faster, such as digital tools for data collection like DataFinch, or other tools that support identifying curriculum for students, or tools that support communication among schools or a family or a team. So these digital tools can help us do behavior analysis, which is a wonderful thing, but it can also help us learn more about behavior analysis. We can use these tools to look at how we do our research, how we improve our practices, what we can do with behavior analysis. The ability to collect data almost ubiquitously across hundreds and thousands and millions of learners, the ability to analyze those data into sets and make predictions not only about the individual, but about the group, to look at under what circumstances, under what contingencies our procedures are most effective, where are behavior analysts most welcome or effective. All of these things are part of this world of digital technologies and this ability to look at learning and data and contingencies all together, anywhere, anytime, any place. So it's an exciting time for behavior analysis in general and behavior analysis in education. And it's great because we now have more than 60 years of research demonstrating the efficacy of behavior analytic techniques for promoting learning in the classroom. We know what works. We've got a great toolkit. We've got our kernels. And we also, our procedures have helped those most vulnerable and probably most in need of our science. Much of our work has been with learners with unique and special needs. This is important work that we should really be proud of. However, behavior analysis also runs the risk of others pigeonholing us into supporting only those populations. And given our remarkable outcomes with severely disabled populations, students with behavior problems, learners with cognitive, social, emotional, or developmental delays or disorders, individuals with autism, given our remarkable progress with those learners, with those populations, it's understandable that people think that this is an area ripe for behavior analysis. But again, it's not the only area that we can work on. We spend a lot of time in that area, but as Pat Fryman noted, those are kind of tails of the continuum. Those are populations that have unique needs, unique assets, probably need some unique strategies to support them along the way. But we also want to help the majority of the population, what he calls the folks under the dome. So we want to think about broadening our reach to all learners, all teachers, all schools. As Pat said, to spend more time under the dome. And he mentioned, to attain mainstream relevance, behavior analysts will have to continue not only to produce results helpful for people at one tail end of the distribution, it also has to produce, more frequently and vigorously, results that are helpful for persons and populations that are under the dome of that distribution. those regular ed K-12 learners, the non-behavior analytic college population, adult learners, business and industry, distance learning, all of those types of things are ripe for behavior analysis to add what we already know about teaching and learning into those areas, into those populations. And we have a tradition of thinking about those larger groups, thinking about the population under the dome. And in fact, in 1990, ABAI, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, wrote a statement on students' rights to effective education. And these are for all students, all learners. And this statement is available on their website, but just a very quick summary. It's talking about behavior analysis and focusing on principles that have been demonstrated to improve learning and performance for all learners. And therefore, all learners are entitled to educational contexts that include environments that maintain and encourage academic success, social skills, achievement and progress. That curriculum and instructional objectives should be based on empirically validated and measurable performance. That assessment should promote useful decision-making about what to do next for the teacher and the learner and both of them together. And that we want instructional methods that support mastery, progression at an optimal pace, sufficient practice, and ongoing revisions to their curriculum as the learner is needed. And this is what behavior analysis is about. This is what our one of our parent organizations, ABAI, says is a basic student right. But ABAI, of course, is not the only entity talking about what are basic student rights or what is important for students. And so in 2015, then President Obama signed into law the Every Student Succeeds Act. And this is the new educational law that covers the land. It has replaced No Child Left Behind, and it talks about all the different things that we are now focusing on as a nation with regard to changes in education. Soon after the law was passed, again in 2015, the U.S. Department of Ed and all of its subdepartments began to put out publications kind of explaining what the law meant and what that meant in terms of policy, what it meant in terms of goals, what it wanted outcomes to be, and started to put forth publications so that state education departments, local school districts, families, and teachers could understand what the law is about and what they were expected to do. And so some of those publications are on the board. Many of them are available from the Department of Education website. But I'm just going to pull a couple statements from some publications. And so these are some policy statements made about education in America. And one of them is a statement that each student has an up-to-date profile of individual strengths, needs, motivations, and goals. Something that I think we could really believe in, that we want to know our students, we want to know what their strengths are, it should all be individualized, we want to know what their goals are, what motivates them. Another statement is that instruction should include both mastery and speed dimensions of fluent performance. So we don't want to make sure that they can do it, we want to make sure that they can do it well, under varying conditions, under conditions of distraction, after not practicing. Another statement is that measurement and evaluation should entail objective curriculum-based measures of performance. We want things to be objective. We want both the learner and the teacher and of course the family to know where the student's going, what they're trying to learn, and how well they're learning that. Another statement is that students progress based on mastery of content, regardless of time, place, or pace of learning, something we probably have already heard earlier in this presentation. And that schools should use data to create a system of interconnected feedback for students, educators, and parents. So I just pulled out 5 statements that I thought I would share with you. All of them probably are congruent with how you're thinking about education or what schools should be about or what students should be entitled to. So I just want to show you in terms of where these publications appeared. You can see the first one about an up-to-date profile of individual strengths, goals, motivations is actually in a U.S. Department of Education publication. The second statement about including both mastery criteria and speed performances, yes, we know it's in ABAI Statement of Effective Education. The same statement, almost verbatim, is there without the speed criteria in the U.S. Department of Ed, that instruction should always include a mastery criteria of what students need to learn. This focus on measurement and evaluation, curriculum-based measures of performance, U.S. Department of Ed, jumping down to schools using data to create that interconnected system of feedback, that shared knowledge base, that's a Department of Ed publication. And both the Department of Ed and ABAI have talked about and put forth the notion that students progress based on mastery. And so that once students master the content, and only when they've mastered the content, do they move forward, again, regardless of time, place, or pace of learning. Just to drill this point home a little bit, and part of that's just to show not only is it an exciting time because of digital technologies and all the history that we have in behavior analysis, but the context for behavior analysis in education is so ripe right now regarding how federal policymakers are looking at education, how that's congruent with a lot of things that we think about with behavior analysis, and how state education departments are now trying to enact a lot of those policies and think about how to implement a lot of these things in their schools. So again, from the U.S. Department of Education, they have a page devoted to competency-based or personalized learning. And so let's go back to that statement about students progressing based on mastery. In the U.S. Department of Ed, this is under that umbrella of competency-based education, that students advance based on meeting or demonstrating competencies, real-world competencies that are relevant to their lives post-school, so relevant to life and job skills. And so it should sound familiar to us. A priority of the U.S. Department of Education is this competency-based learning, which they call CBE. We actually used to call it mastery-based learning, MBL. And the Department of Ed talks about competency-based education having several key features. Again, that progression based on mastery, but also that there's better in student engagement because education is individualized, learning is individualized. The content should be relevant to each student and tailored to their unique needs, of course not just their needs, but also their interests and their aspirations, and that we get better student outcomes because education is individualized. And this is not just special education where we've known about IEPs and individualized education for decades. This is talking about all learners in K-12 education. And so state education departments in the country, across the country, are now charged with how do we do this in our districts? How do we do this in our schools? What changes have to be made? How might this be implemented? What professional development has to occur? What structural differences are there? Will it work in our districts, with our schools, with our teachers, with our students? And so behavior analysis, I think, can help all of these state ed departments, all of these districts, answer those very, very real questions. And that's an opportunity we'll turn to in just a moment. Just wanted to share, here's a real life example. This is about a little over a year old. This is from the New York Times, talking about a public high school in Queens, New York that has implemented competency-based education, CBE. So they did away with traditional letter grades. Students do not earn A's through F's or satisfactories or unsatisfactories. Every student meets mastery. It just changes how much time it takes that student to meet that mastery, what type of support they might get to meet that mastery. But every student meets mastery and then advances only after demonstrating that mastery. The goal for students is to learn the material sooner or later, but eventually to make sure that they learn the material. In this school, students curate their own learning playlist. So they identify what they're going to learn when, how they're going to strategize, the best practices to study, to prepare material, what goes well with what they've just learned. And they progress at their own pace, and they have the knowledge and responsibility for taking charge of their own education. From the article, a 7th grader rattles off his computational profile, and he says, let's see, I can find the area and perimeter of a polygon. I can solve mathematical and real-world problems using a coordinated plane. I still need to get better at dividing multiple digit numbers, which means I should probably practice that more. So here's the student taking responsibility for his own learning, pinpointing, identifying what the objectives are, what his strengths are, and where he needs to practice. And that's something we would want for all learners. So this is an example of one school in Queens, New York. What about the rest of the country? So here's a snapshot of competency-based education across the nation for K-12 schools, K-12 public schools. And just a very quick explanation. The color coding is orange, means it's an advanced state. This state has definite policies and procedures in place to support competency-based education, whether that's doing away with the Carnegie unit or seat time restrictions, whether it's advancing based on mastery between grade levels or subject matter, whether it's doing away with letter grades, whether it's how students demonstrate competencies. They have policies and procedures in place to support local districts and schools to implement competency-based education. So orange is advanced, green is developing. The yellowish, that color, are emerging states, so they're doing task force, or beginning to think about how they might do this, setting up some initial policies and testing them out, running pilots. The lone state with no color nor dash whatsoever, we won't call out names as to what state that is, currently has no policies in education, but I hear that is actually about to change, and they're about to start a pilot with a few districts with regarding having students advance at their own pace. And then the states with the slash lines or the dash lines also work with this Innovation Lab Network, this special consortium of districts and schools set up by the federal government and a few private partners to support innovation in schools, so using digital technologies to also advance competency-based education. And so many of us behavior analysts probably live in one of these states, or close to it, or grew up in one, or know people that live in one or more of these states. These are states that are wondering, how do I do CBE? How do I set up self-paced instruction? How do I measure mastery? How do I know when students are ready to move on, and how do I let them know? How do they know when they're ready to move on? What do they move on to? How do we provide learners help for some things and other learners help for other things? How do I differentiate instruction? These are all questions that we can answer. So it's a tremendous opportunity for behavior analysts in schools at the state, district, and local school level. So it's a really, again, the context is ripe for behavior analysis in education. But it takes that behavioral systems approach that we know so well. We know the importance of systems and analyzing the pieces of systems and how they integrate and how they work together. And in a behavioral systems approach, of course, we want to focus on evidence-based instruction. We only want to use strategies and tactics that we know will work under those conditions with those learners. And in that systems approach, if we're working with schools thinking about competency-based education or any other aspect of good education, we want to think about individualized and personalized learning. In competency-based education, flexible instruction. Again, moving away from grades or grade levels. So thinking about the systems. How do we build systems that support a lack of grade level? How do you develop high school transcripts without grades or grade levels? How do colleges know who to admit? It is a huge systems problem that we can help with. Thinking about self-pacing, self-monitoring. We have a lot of literature on how to support that in individuals. And of course, this anytime, any-place learning. We are used to working in different contexts and supporting learning across different contexts. Other pieces of behavioral systems, well, this is also great, and it ties into those digital technologies in that broader area, because a lot of this is tied into learning analytics. We now have the capacity to know what we are all learning, what our students are learning, when they're learning, under what context they're learning it. We can feed that into machine learning type algorithms where we start to be able to make predictions. These machines help us make predictions about what are the contexts or contingencies that help an individual learner, a group of learners with certain characteristics, or all learners. We can use a lot of educational data mining to learn how to build better instruction. We can embed assessment and know where learners are all the time, not just us, but the learner themselves, and use that for really robust, refined, data-based education decision making. That behavioral systems approach, a lot of schools across the country, when they're thinking about all of these changes and the onset of technology in schools, they're thinking about digital badging, not just for students and students earning badges based on competencies, but also for their teachers. They're thinking about micro-credentialing, so that rather than having a full, long professional development session about a plethora of topics, focusing on a particular skill, teaching it really well to a teacher, looking at the teacher using that skill, practicing that skill in the classroom, and then awarding a digital badge or a micro-credential based on that. Sounds a lot like behavioral skills training, something again that we have to offer these schools and school systems trying to do these things. And then of course there's always this interest in motivation. How do you keep students motivated? How do you keep educators motivated and engaged? And gamification and game-based learning, which is also, we know, is based on a lot of schedules of reinforcement and ways to play around with schedules of reinforcement and reinforcement contingencies and markers for behavior along the way. Again, things that we know a lot about that we could probably help these environments. But again, not as a one-off approach. It's a behavioral systems problem. It's a systems problem that we can approach with our behavioral systems analysis. And of course, I would argue that we can't do any of that without a good foundation in instructional design. And behavior analysis has had a long, rich history and really good behavioral, really good instructional design. In fact, in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, behavior analysts were at the forefront of instructional design across the nation. People like Susan Meyer-Markle, excuse me, Phil Tiemann, James Holland, Robert Mager, Tom Gilbert, Don Toasty, all these folks talking to the broader audience about critical features in instructional design, things like problem solving, critical thinking, analysis, building concepts, all of these types of things that sometimes we might think is out of the realm of behavior analysis. It's actually not. It is right in our wheelhouse. So none of that would be possible without this behavioral engineering of instructional contingencies. And so while there are still a few behavior analysts that teach behavioral instructional design as part of their university courses, or a few CEUs offered now and then about behavior analytic instructional design, regrettably, it might be becoming a lost art in behavior analysis. So I would challenge any of you that's watching this or thinking about behavior analysis in education, get back into behavioral instructional design. Think about how you can share those strategies, those tactics, that knowledge with others. And a good place to start are a lot of these books on behavior analytic instructional design. We really do have superior instructional strategies, and it's not by accident, it's by design. So take a look at these books. You guys can zoom in on the slide when you're looking at it. You know, these are great. You could read anything on the design of instruction by Julie or Ernie Vargas, B.F. Skinner, again, Jim Holland or Susan Meyer-Markle or Phil Tiemann, Sig Engelman, Kent Johnson, Joe Lang, Joanne Robbins, lots of people talking about really good instructional design so that we don't let it become a lost art. So, behavior analysis in education, it's a phenomenal opportunity, but there are also a few speed bumps on that road to us being able to help our nation's schools and students and teachers. The first speed bump probably has to do with education. And it's funny because this talk is about education, but this speed bump is about the education of behavior analysts. I think that we probably do not let our young behavior analysts that are new into the field, or individuals studying behavior analysis, we probably don't share as much as we could about, one, the rich history of behavior analysis in education, but also the opportunities for behavior analysts in regular education. So it's our education of behavior analysts that I think is the speed bump in this particular example. It's providing that foundation, behavioral education, so they can stand on the shoulders of giants. They know what these kernels are, they know what these instructional design strategies and tactics are, and that they can stand on those shoulders and move the field forward. Again, very few professors teach instructional design, but actually very few behavior analytic programs are in colleges of education. Most are in psychology, and now thankfully in departments of behavior analysis, but very, very few nowadays are in colleges of education. And so that's a thought. If we don't have programs in college, or many programs in colleges of education, have our behavior analysts take a few quality courses in education, stepping across the aisle, across the field, looking at education. So take general or regular education theory courses, just so you know what the rest of the world is talking about. Take education policy courses so that we can influence policy and think about what are, again, the systems that support policy. Students are regularly encouraged to get teacher certification or principal or supervisory administrative certification. These are great certifications for behavior analysts to pick up, especially if they want to work in school systems or have credibility in with people that work in school systems. There are over 100,000 public schools in the United States and 40,000 more charter or public schools. There are huge opportunities. These are places of need for these are places of need of behavior analysts. All of those schools need a principal, an assistant principal, a curriculum and instruction specialist, a professional development specialist, someone to look at their data and analysis systems and think about how to improve teaching and learning on a small and large scale. All of these are opportunities for behavior analysis. Another speed bump I would say is probably the experience that we give our young behavior analysts or our behavior analytics students. Whether intended or not, probably most of our experience for behavior analysts is one-on-one instruction with learners, one-on-one or small group. And for better or for worse, that's not how most of education runs. It's larger group, whole class, and of course those things are changing, but we need to be able to give our behavior analysts the experience to deal with large groups of students. We need to give them supervised experience in school settings where they learn a lot of the contingencies that operate in schools, to understand the school culture, how a school system operates. The contingencies are very, very different in public schools and in schools in general than in some of the clinics or some of the more specialized settings that a lot of our behavior analysts gain experience. And so to change teacher behavior, we need to provide lots and lots of practice to our behavior analysts on changing teacher behavior. We need to give them practice on the things that we want them to do. Finally, I think another speed bump is expertise. And both education and experience come together to represent expertise. To develop expertise, we need to develop behavior analysts' verbal behavior about the science, verbal behavior with regard to behavior analysis in education. We need to build their fluency in thinking and talking about behavior analysis in education, the knowledge, the strategies, and the tactics. And we need the contingency-shaped behaviors that comes with lots of time and lots of time behaving inside schools, inside school systems, with teachers, with administrators, with other people that are part of the educational environment. And that experience comes from combining, the expertise comes from combining that education and that knowledge and that experience together into this verbally mediated kind of problem-solving repertoire, this expertise to be able to go into a school system, to be able to look at the problems, analyze the contingencies, draw on your wealth of knowledge, draw on your experience, and be able to be part of a solution, part of a difference within that school system. I think this also leads, and it's not listed on the slide, but acceptance. And acceptance of behavior analysis as a science, or as a practice, or as a field, or acceptance of behavior analysts as individuals. Every once in a while we've had a rocky road with that, and luckily we've had many, many people, wonderful people in our field, talk about both how do you get behavior analysis more greatly accepted in education. Many of the articles that I cited before talk about that. We've had wonderful leaders in our field talk about how do we promote the message of behavior analysis in general. How do we meet people where they are? How do we bring behavior analysis so that everyone gets better, so that we share our science in a way that's both humble and meaningful? And so I think that expertise also comes together and of course is important in school systems. So a couple of things that I wanted to leave you with. There are lots and lots of practices and programs that are built on behavior analysis, that are congruent to behavior analysis, that share features with behavior analysis. We've talked about many of these. Again, this is just a very, very short list. There are numerous education journals and education research journals, but here's a handful that really focus on behavioral education or support behavior analysis in education and in practice. And there are a few related ABAI SIGs with regard to behavior analysis. So there are ways to learn more information about this topic. And again, I just want to remind us that there are numerous opportunities for behavior analysts in education. And again, that's both professional, kind of one-on-one opportunities where you can work in a school, work in a local educational agency, work in a state educational agency, work at the federal level. These are opportunities that are open to us, and the need is out there. The positions are out there. If we don't want to do something like that, we could be nominated or voted in or work on a local school board. We can work on instructional design. We can build better programs. We can do product development and improve the apps and the technology and things like that, the user experience for things out there. So there are a lot of individual professional opportunities for behavior analysis in education. We can support professional development of teachers and the implementation of good strategies and effective tactics in schools. So we can support others' professional development and support their implementation. For those geeks of us that still love data and science and analyzing why things are coming together the way they do or what the variables are, there's so much work to be done in data science and research and effective practices. It's a wonderful, huge field, and we're just discovering the kinds of questions that can be asked with regard to behavior analysis, education, and what data science can offer. And again, I want to stress, we can have a voice on the policy stage. And policy, we know it's the SD or the antecedent that may occasion some behavior. So if we can get that antecedent going and then provide the contingencies and consequences to support that behavior, we might be able to change education. And so as Pat Fryman said, if we can do all of these things, if we can get comfortable under the dome, we can have that type of effect. So the words that I want to leave you with go back to Fred Keller, and this is what he was asked. He gave this response when asked about the state of education in America, and it seems like such a hard ship to turn, and there are so many difficulties and so many problems and so many voices and so many things going on, and how do you not get discouraged? How do you keep changing, keep thinking that you can change education? And so Fred Keller said, when you see something good taking place, reinforce it. And of course we believe that. We want to reinforce everything that we see in a school that we walk into, every teacher behavior, every student behavior, that we want to catch them being good. So we want to reinforce everything that we see that we can support that's good. But it's also true, as he said, that anytime you see a model school that looks like it's applying good behavioral principles, give it your support. I believe the process is something like shaping. If we all keep on nibbling, we can change education. And that's the point. It's going to take all of us to keep on nibbling, all of us to keep reinforcing good wherever we find it. And together, I think we can continue to follow that trajectory and move that ship and improve education with behavior analysis. So thank you.